The snow fell in sheets, so thick it swallowed sound whole. A German artillery officer pressed his binoculars against his frozen face and stared at the town in the valley below. His breath turned to vapor the instant it left his lips, crystallizing in the brutal air as artillery thudded somewhere beyond the tree line. Around him, for elite German divisions, some of the finest soldiers the Reich still possessed, had completely encircled an American force that had no business still standing. December 19, 1944. Bastogne, Belgium. The temperature had dropped to 12 degrees below zero. The cold was not just weather, it was a weapon. The Americans inside the perimeter were surrounded, outnumbered, cut off from supply lines, low on ammunition, short on food, and freezing in foxholes carved into iron-hard ground. By every calculation of modern warfare, by every doctrine taught in staff colleges across Europe, they should have surrendered by dawn. They did not. If stories like this one make you lean forward in your seat, hit that like button right now and subscribe so you never miss another. Drop a comment below and tell us where in the world you are watching from. We get viewers from every corner of the globe, from Buenos Aires to Berlin, from Seoul to Sydney. And every single one of those comments reminds us that this history still matters. Now, let's go back to the moment the Third Reich began to understand exactly what it was fighting. The formal German surrender demand had arrived at the American command post at 11:30 that morning. It was a professional document, polite, even. It described a hopeless American position with the cold clarity of a mathematics problem, then offered surrender as the only rational conclusion. General Anthony McAuliffe, commanding the 101st Airborne Division inside the encircled town, read it quietly. The room around him was silent except for the distant crump of artillery. He set the letter on the table. He picked up a pen, and he wrote back a single word, Nuts. That word would travel up through German command, reach the situation maps in Berlin, and eventually land on the desk of a man who had spent 12 years telling the world that American soldiers were fundamentally incapable of the will it took to fight and die for something. That word was not bravado. It was not theater. It was the distilled expression of everything the German intelligence machine had been quietly, uncomfortably reporting for 2 years. That the Americans were not what Hitler had promised they would be. And by December 1944, he was running out of ways to explain it away. Rewind to February 1943. The Tunisian desert. The wind carried sand that stripped the paint from vehicles and scoured the skin from exposed hands. At Kasserine Pass, in the rocky hills of western Tunisia, German armor under the command of Field Marshal Erwin Rommel tore through American lines with brutal, practiced efficiency. The USI Corps collapsed. Nearly 3,000 American soldiers were captured in 2 days. Hundreds more were killed. Dozens of Sherman tanks, outgunned by German armor before the battle had fairly started, burned on the desert floor like signal fires. The humiliation was total. A panzer commander who watched the rout from a hill above the pass wrote afterward that the Americans had fought like soldiers who had read about war rather than trained for it. He was not being unkind. He was being accurate. The American army that arrived in North Africa in late 1942 was the product of a military machine that had been functionally demobilized for 2 decades. Their officers were inexperienced. Their combined arms coordination was poor. Their tactical communications broke down under combat pressure. It was not a failure of courage so much as a failure of preparation. Hitler read the Kasserine reports with deep satisfaction. They confirmed everything his racial ideology had promised. A democracy, he had always argued, could not produce the kind of soldier that a nation forged by National Socialist doctrine could. The American army was a mixture of ethnicities, Irish and Polish and Italian and Jewish and black soldiers fighting under the same flag, and that diversity, Hitler insisted, was a structural weakness. It diluted purpose. It undermined cohesion. The Wehrmacht, built on racial purity and ideological discipline, would always have the edge against such a force. Kasserine seemed to prove it. He stopped reading too early, because within 6 weeks, something happened that no German military planner had budgeted for. The American II Corps reorganized. A new commander arrived, General George S. Patton. Patton was not a diplomat. He was not a manager. He was something the Wehrmacht understood instinctively, a soldier who believed, viscerally and completely, that his job was to find the enemy and destroy him. He trained his men with furious intensity. Officers who had performed poorly at Kasserine were relieved on the spot and replaced. Soldiers who had been shaken were pushed back onto the line and made to fight again. The institutional learning happened not over months, but over weeks. By May 1943, those same Americans who had broken at Kasserine had helped trap 150,000 Axis troops in a coastal pocket with no exit. The Afrika Korps, the legendary force that had made Rommel's name, that had chased the British across Libya and back, surrendered in its entirety. A Wehrmacht colonel captured in those final days told his American escort officer, "You are not the same army that was here in February." He was right. They never would be again. The lessons of North Africa were still being written when June 6, 1944 arrived. The English Channel, the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare. 156,000 men crossing open water in the dark, loaded with equipment, pointed at a coastline, fortified with concrete and steel and the weapons of a defending army that had been told it was impregnable. At Omaha Beach, soldiers from the American 1st and 29th Infantry Divisions stepped off their landing craft into chaos so complete it defied description. The German 352nd Infantry Division dug into bluffs and fortified draws above the waterline, opened fire with everything it had. The water turned red within minutes. Officers were killed before they reached the shore. NCOs were killed on the sand. Equipment was lost. Radio contact was broken. The plan, such as it was, dissolved the moment it hit the beach. And what happened next was the thing that German commanders would describe for years afterward with something approaching disbelief. The Americans kept coming. Not because they had orders. Not because officers were directing them from behind. But because somewhere in the training and the culture and the bone-deep American dislike of being told they could not do something, they simply kept moving forward. By nightfall, they held Omaha Beach. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the West, sent his assessment to Berlin in the days following the landings. His language was measured, but his meaning was clear. American infantry, he wrote, exhibited tactical aggressiveness under fire that was inconsistent with their brief experience of European ground combat. They did not break when flanked. They did not halt when their armor was destroyed. Individual soldiers and small units made decisions without waiting for orders from above, and those decisions were often tactically sound. This was not, Rundstedt noted carefully, the behavior of a hollow army. Hitler dismissed it, material advantage, air power, logistics. The Americans could not fight man for man. The Hurtgen farce was waiting to argue the point. From September 1944 through February 1945, American forces fought one of the most brutal and least celebrated campaigns of the entire war. Inside 50 square miles of dense German woodland along the Belgian-German border. There were no open plains here for tank formations to maneuver. No clear sky for air support. No lines of sight for artillery. Just pine trees packed so tightly that daylight barely reached the ground, and German defenders who had spent months preparing every meter of that darkness. Concrete bunkers. Tripwire mines. Interlocking machine gun positions designed to kill at the distances you find between trees. The fighting was close enough to hear a man's last breath. The 9th, 28th, and 4th Infantry Divisions of the U.S. Army bled through that farce with a determination that stunned the soldiers they were fighting. The 28th Division, which German troops had begun calling the Bloody Bucket after the red keystone on their divisional shoulder patch, suffered over 6,000 casualties in less in a month of fighting. Entire battalions were reduced to skeleton strength and had to be rebuilt in the field. Replacements arrived and were killed before anyone had learned their names. And still the Americans attacked. A German battalion commander who had served on the Eastern Front, who had fought through Stalingrad and the frozen hell of the Russian winter, submitted a report in November 1944 that was stark in its professional assessment. American infantry in the Hurtgen, he wrote, demonstrated a stubbornness in close-range combat that compared to anything he had witnessed in 2 years against Soviet forces. He had expected the casualty rate to break their offensive spirit. It had not. If anything, the resistance made them more dangerous, not less. The snow came in November. It settled on the shell craters and turned the brown mud gray. It clung to the helmets of dead men and the rifles of living ones. The guns continued without pause. Supply trucks moved in darkness because daylight meant air attack. Medics worked in conditions that would have been considered unconscionable in any peacetime frame of reference. The farce had stopped being a military objective and become something else entirely, a test of what a man was made of when everything else had been taken away. The Americans passed that test, mile by miserable mile. By late autumn 1944, German intelligence had accumulated something they could not dismiss, a consistent pattern of American performance across 3 different theaters, across 2 years of serious ground combat, across every terrain type the European war had to offer. The reports arrived in Berlin quietly, in typed pages and field summaries, and they said the same thing in different words. The Americans were not what the Fuhrer had described. They were not soft. They were not brittle. They were not dependent on material advantage to fight. They were dangerous. That word, gefährlich, began appearing with increasing frequency in assessments from frontline commanders. Dangerous, adaptable, fast learners, difficult to predict. Hitler's response was the same each time. The commanders who wrote these words were making excuses. For their own failures, he had one card left. He intended to play it. On December 16, 1944, before dawn, the Ardennes offensive began. 3 German armies minus 450,000 men, 1,400 tanks, more than 2,600 pieces of artillery, crashed through the weakest section of the Allied line in the forested hills of Belgium and Luxembourg. The plan was breathtaking in its ambition. Drive 100 miles through the frozen landscape, cross the Meuse River, capture the critical port of Antwerp, split the Allied armies in 2, and inflict a defeat so devastating that Britain and America would seek a negotiated peace. Hitler had personally designed the plan. He was certain it would work. It had worked before. In May 1940, through these same forests, the Wehrmacht had bypassed the Maginot Line and broken France in 6 weeks. History would repeat. The Americans would shatter like the French had. The offensive would expose their weakness for the world to see. The first 24 hours looked like Hitler might be right. American units in the Ardennes sector were thinly spread and took the blow without warning. Communications were severed. Rear area troops, cooks, mechanics, supply clerks, men who had never expected to fire their weapons in anger, were suddenly fighting for their lives as German armor poured through the gaps. The town of Clairvaux fell. The road to Bastogne was cut. In the fog and the snow and the chaos of the first days, the German offensive looked unstoppable. Then something shifted. Scattered American units that had lost all contact with their headquarters did not wait for orders. They stopped. They looked around. They organized whoever was nearby and started fighting back. A captain without a company commandeered men from 3 different units and held a crossroads for 11 hours against a German armored force. A sergeant from an engineering battalion destroyed a bridge under direct tank fire to slow an SS column. Across the entire length of the breakthrough, in dozens of locations no German planner had specifically targeted, Americans decided on their own authority to make themselves an obstacle. It bought enough time. The 101st Airborne Division arrived at Bastogne on December 19th. dropped into position with incomplete equipment and no cold-weather gear, and held the town against everything four German divisions could bring to bear. They held it for 9 days. They held it through artillery bombardments that leveled buildings around them, through temperatures that froze weapons and killed men who stayed still too long, through a supply situation so desperate that medics were reusing bandages. The German surrender demand that arrived on December 22nd was met with McAuliffe's single-word reply, the same reply that had already traveled halfway to Berlin before nightfall. Nuts, outside, in the snow, Patton's Third Army was already moving. In an operational feat that military historians still cite with admiration, the entire Third Army, hundreds of thousands of men, thousands of vehicles, pivoted 90 degrees from its current axis, in ice and darkness, and drove north toward Bastogne at maximum speed. The movement covered 75 miles in 72 hours, in winter, through roads clogged with refugees and retreating units. On December 26th, lead elements of the 4th Armored Division punched through the German encirclement and reached the 101st. Bastogne was relieved. The offensive was finished by January. Germany had spent 100,000 casualties and its last armored reserve on a gamble that had failed. The Western Front was now irretrievably broken open. General Hasse von Manteuffel, whose 5th Panzer Army had led the assault, was as honest in defeat as any commander in that war. His post-battle assessment described American military performance with the careful precision of a professional soldier setting down what he had actually witnessed. Regardless of what his own side had predicted, American infantry and armor coordination was fluid and effective. American artillery response time was faster than any army he had encountered. American soldiers in encircled or surrounded positions fought harder, not softer. And American junior leaders, sergeants, lieutenants, captains, made tactical decisions with an independence and competence that he had not believed an army of such recent vintage could possess. Von Manteuffel had spent years on the Eastern Front. He knew what a dangerous enemy was. He had not expected to find one in the Ardennes. In his bunker beneath Berlin in the opening months of 1945, Hitler still repeated the old formulations: mongrel democracy, soft soldiers, a nation incapable of true martial spirit. He said these things the way a man repeats a prayer whose meaning has gone hollow, from habit, from the need to fill silence, from the impossibility of admitting that everything he had built his world upon was wrong. The words came out of his mouth and dissolved into the cold underground air with that conviction. The Rhine fell on March 7, 1945. American soldiers from the 9th Armored Division found the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen still standing, intact through either German engineering failure or plain bad luck, and crossed it under fire. They were across before the bridge could be destroyed. Engineers followed immediately. By the end of the day, a bridgehead existed on the eastern bank of the last great natural barrier between the Allied armies and the German heartland. Hitler ordered the officers responsible for the bridge's survival to be court-martialed and shot. It did not change anything. The river was crossed. American forces spreading from the Rhine bridgeheads in March and April 1945 were no longer the green troops who faltered at Kasserine. They were veterans of the brutal years: Omaha Beach, the Bocage, the Hürtgen Forests, the Ardennes. They moved through Germany with practiced competence, sustained not by ideology, but by trust in their sergeants and in the men on either side of them. That bond, forged in the worst battlefields of the war, could not be manufactured. They were not fearless. Fear lived in the gut before every assault, at Omaha, in the Hürtgen, in every frozen foxhole. Fear was not the absence of courage. It was its beginning. What they possessed was something harder than doctrine, the stubborn refusal to stop. Not for cold casualties or bad odds. Not for encirclement or polite surrender letters. They would not stop because the man beside them would not stop, and because they believed, plainly and without speeches, that the war was worth finishing. The panzer commander who had mocked them at Kasserine was captured in 1945 by soldiers of the 1st Infantry Division. The sergeant who processed him said nothing. He simply did his job. That silence answered everything. Not statistics. Not tanks or all. Ordinary Americans had crossed an ocean and defeated a professional army on its own ground. The word was nuts. The meaning was forever.